All right, macroeconomics students, here we are with Module 65, Part 2 video. We're starting on page 3 of our notes, and we just got done talking about what happens to the price level and the real GDP when the aggregate demand curve shifts. And now we're going to talk about what happens when the aggregate supply curve shifts, which are called supply shocks. Okay, so here we have a negative supply shock is a decrease in my handwriting. Decrease in short run aggregate supply. And remember, decreases are to the left. And then over here, when we talk about positive supply shocks, that will be the increase in short run aggregate supply. And of course, that is to the right. So we're getting really good at these graphs now, so let's go ahead and graph out both of these, the decrease over here and the increase over here. Price level and real GDP for our axes. We can always start by drawing in our first short-run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve. And then that will give us our first equilibrium point, our first price level, and our first point of real GDP. So over on the left, we are doing a decrease in short-run aggregate supply, which is a leftward shift. So here's our line. This is to the left of it. Short-run aggregate supply 2. Which gives us our second equilibrium point, which then gives us our second price level and our second real GDP. And then over here, our increase to the right. So our second short-run aggregate supply curve, our second equilibrium point, our second price level, and our second real GDP. All right, so now let's read these graphs and see what they have to tell us. So this graph, it tells us when short-run aggregate supply curve decreases, price level increases, and real GDP decreases. This over here, when short-run aggregate supply curve increases, then price level decreases and real GDP increases. Okay, so now let's remind ourselves what are those causes. So this over here, causes of aggregate demand going down, and over here, this will be the causes of aggregate demand going up or increasing. So aggregate, oh no, I totally said that wrong. We're not talking about aggregate demand. Wait, sorry. Short run aggregate supply going down and short run aggregate supply going up. I apologize. Okay, so if the production costs go up, that means that the price of the inputs for that company goes up. That decreases short run aggregate supply because it means that profits go down. All right. If productivity goes down, that means, again, that profits go down, which means that the short-run aggregate supply will go down. Now, remember, a decrease in productivity is often caused by those government rules and regulations. I'm not saying that government rules and regulations are bad. I'm just saying that they decrease productivity. So remember, we often do those government rules and regulations for the purpose of safety, health, and fairness. And so that means that if we want to get more of that safety, health, and fairness, it sometimes costs us a little bit of that productivity. And we talked in the last module about like why that is, the idea that if there are more rules on a business, well then maybe they can't do things as quickly as they could otherwise. All right, over here, so this would be the opposite. So if production costs go down, that means the price of the inputs go down, which means that profits go up. And then if productivity goes up, that means that profits go up. And productivity going up is often caused by advances in new technology. So if we have new technology, or if businesses have new technology, it often means that then they can be more productive and have higher profits, which makes that short run aggregate supply curve go to the right or increase. Because whenever they can make more profits, more people want to supply that product, which means our short run aggregate supply goes up. All right, so this is kind of a different little topic down here, stagflation. It's called stagflation because it's this combination of stagnation plus inflation. Now, if something is stagnant, it's not moving, it's not changing. So stagnation in this sense means no economic growth. And then inflation, we know that that means when the price level goes up. So if we have this stagnant economy that is not moving plus inflation, it means that we're going to have unemployment and inflation at the same time. That definitely gets a sad face, because usually how it works is if we have high unemployment, we usually then have low inflation. But there have been these periods in history where we had high unemployment and high inflation. Totally sucks, because it means people are out of work, wages are going down, business profits are going down, and the price of stuff is going up. That's a really bad spot that we don't want to be in as a nation. Now, what we're talking about here, I'm not really relating it to what we talked about here. Your book went through it and I wanted you to know about that. Okay, so then on to page 4. So long run macroeconomic equilibrium. Here we're going to put all 3 of those curves together, our aggregate demand curve, our short run aggregate supply curve, and our long run aggregate supply curve. Now this long run macroeconomic equilibrium, this gets a smiley face because this is where we want the economy to be. It means that suppliers are producing up to their potential, like they're using all of their resources, they're being efficient. Consumers are buying what suppliers are producing, and there's no cyclical unemployment. Remember, the cyclical unemployment is the crappy unemployment that happens during recessions. So that means that there would only be natural unemployment. That unemployment that's going to happen no matter what the economy is doing, it's only natural. All right, so let's graph this out. Of course, we have our price level and our real GDP. We have our short run aggregate supply curve, and we have our aggregate demand curve. Now, when it's in long run equilibrium, all 3 lines add up, or they all join together at the same spot. When we're writing this by hand, that can be difficult sometimes. So what I do is I just start there and I go down and I go up. Now, let's say that you were trying to draw yours in and you sort of missed a little bit and you made it to the side. Here's a little trick for how to fix that. When we put our dot that shows where the economy is going to be, just make a big old dot and it looks like they line up perfectly. So anyway, we put our dot here. Ooh, I forgot to label long run aggregate supply curve. Remember, that dot represents where the economy is. So if that dot is right there and all 3 of those lines meet together, that's a good thing. And that means that the economy is in long run equilibrium. And like we said before, that's a good thing. All right, so let's go to page 5 of our notes. Sorry, struggling with turning the page there. Okay, so We like this idea of being in long run equilibrium, but we're not always in long run equilibrium. Sometimes the economy gets crappy. That is called a recessionary gap. And sometimes, believe it or not, the economy gets like too good, it's too hot, and that is called an inflationary gap. And we're going to talk in a moment about why it could be too good. What does that mean? All right, recessionary gap, that is just a fancy word of saying a recession. It is when unemployment is high and GDP is low. Okay, so here's how we draw a recessionary gap. You just start by drawing your short run aggregate supply curve and your aggregate demand curve, and we're going to put in our price level and we're going to put in our real GDP. And we're going to put our dot where those two meet because the dot represents where the economy is. And then our long run aggregate supply curve is going to go to the right of that. Long run aggregate supply. Okay, now what does this mean? Well, if you remember from our notes from the last module, the long run aggregate supply curve represents the potential of the economy. It represents like awesomeness. It represents that we only have natural unemployment, so a really low unemployment rate. It represents that, businesses are creating and building and supplying as much as they can, and that everyone's buying all that stuff. Yay, happy economy. Okay, now a recessionary gap is not a happy economy because remember, the long run aggregate supply curve represents the good spot, okay? So at this spot here, that is, that's that 4% unemployment rate. That is that all resources being used. Well, but if the economy is here at this dot, that means that the unemployment rate is higher than that. So maybe that would be like a 7% unemployment rate or a 10% unemployment rate. We'll just put 7% just to say that it's higher than 4%. Now, oh good Lord, what am I trying to do to you? Because look at this. We all know that on a graph that is 0. And how can we go from 0 to 7 to 4? Because on this graph, it's actually employment that goes from 0 and up, and unemployment is like the opposite of employment, so it looks a little backwards. So I apologize for that. Darn you, econ. So what this means is that the unemployment rate, it's above the natural unemployment rate. So it's above 4%, and that the output is below the potential output. If you want to put those in little simpler terms, it means that the unemployment rate is high and the output is low. And of course, this is a big old sad face situation. So we described before a recession on our business cycle as kind of, here's our business cycle, right? The recession was like this crappy part, right? When it's going down. Well, that crappy part on this ADAS model looks like the short run equilibrium being to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so you might want to write that down somewhere, that short run equilibrium is to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve. Oh, fine, I'll write it too. In a recessionary gap, comma, short run equilibrium is to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, here we go. On to our inflationary gap. Inflationary gap is also another sad face. And here is how we draw that. We again start out with your short run aggregate supply curve and your aggregate demand curve. Label price level, label real GDP, label your equilibrium point. So the economy is always going to be in short run equilibrium. It's always going to be where the short run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve meet. So like notice up here, the economy, it's always going to be short run aggregate supply curve meeting aggregate demand. It's not always going to meet the long run aggregate supply curve. We want it to, but it won't always. All right, so look at this. Here, the output was too low. Well, here we're going to make the output too high, which means that the output is actually to the right of the long run aggregate supply curve. So what that means is that, long run aggregate supply curve represents like a 4% unemployment rate. Well, maybe if we're over here, it might represent a 2 or a 3% unemployment rate. Let's just put 3%. It never really gets much lower than that. All right, so what it means is that the unemployment rate is very low, and it means that output is very high. Now, why in the world would this situation get a sad face? Why in the world would this not be a good thing, right? So like the question is, well, why is that a problem? Why would anyone run around and say, oh my God, unemployment rate's too low? And you know what? Politicians, they're not going to say that. People aren't going to say that. Businesses, they might say that. Because it's a problem, because notice how it's called an inflationary gap. Well, it's a problem because it causes inflation. Imagine that. And here's why. It's kind of like a little story that I have to tell to explain why. So in an inflationary gap, the unemployment rate is super duper low. And any business that wants to hire somebody, and by the way, they do want to hire people because people are buying so much of their stuff, they want to hire more people to make more stuff and then make more money, right? So life is great, but a business in an inflationary gap who wants to hire somebody has a big problem. Because imagine this, all right, so I like to talk about myself and my family, so I'm going to talk about my mom, right? My mom used to own a business, an office, and she had a secretary. Well, think of it if my mom needed to hire a secretary during that time of an inflationary gap. Well, she would put out an ad on the internet or wherever things are done these days, and for a secretary. And she might say, I need somebody who can type. I need somebody who can work a computer, and they can answer the phones and be nice to people when they show up, right? And because there is an inflationary gap and because unemployment is so low, maybe nobody applies for the job, or the people who do apply for the job, they can't type and they're mean to people on the phone, right? So what does she have to do to attract those people who meet all those qualifications, right? They can type, they can be nice to people on the phone, and they can work a computer. What is she going to have to do to get those people to apply for the job and she can hire someone who she needs to? Some of you know it. She's going to have to raise wages. She's going to have to, instead of being like, I'll pay $15 an hour, lady's going to have to offer like 25, 30 bucks an hour to get somebody with those qualifications, because the unemployment rate is so low that people who are qualified to have good jobs. So that means, it causes inflation because a low unemployment rate causes wages to increase. And that's not just true for new hires. That's when the economy is super great, people who have jobs, they can be like, I think I need a raise because all these other people are offering me these really great jobs for more money. So I'm going to go take that other job unless you give me more money. That actually happens during inflationary gaps when it's hard to hire people. And so then these companies have to raise wages. And to pay for raising those wages, they're going to raise their prices. And raising prices, what is that called? Inflation. So that's why inflationary gaps are a sad face, a bad thing. However, politicians aren't going to tell you that, and we don't feel like it's a bad thing. but inflation in general is a bad thing. So there are certain parts of the government who will try to keep inflation low during an inflationary gap. Okay, that's it for part 2. We're going to take a pause and we'll be back with part 3.